Hello and welcome to Dialogue. As China faces a possible new COVID surge over the Spring Festival holiday, rumors have been running rampant about the effectiveness of COVID vaccines. So how important is vaccination in boosting the immunity and reducing severe symptoms? And is it still necessary to get vaccinated after you've been infected? How likely is it we could have a vaccine that will eradicate the virus in a complete manner? To find out, I'm joined today by Dr. Alice Hyunkyung Tan, internist at MizMedi Women's Hospital, Dr. Dennis Carroll, president of the Global Virome Project, Dr. William Haseltine, chair and president of Access Health International, and Shao Yiming, member of Vaccine Task Force of China's State Council Joint Prevention and Control Mechanism and chief expert on AIDS of China's CDC. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Well, thank you for joining us. We have a strong panel today to answer all the questions about vaccines and vaccination. Well, I think people in general are familiar with vaccines. For example, we eradicated smallpox completely. And the World Health Organization is trying to do the same for polio and measles. And then the question is I will start with Dr. Tan. How different is COVID-19 from, for example, smallpox?
Well, COVID-19 is a different disease altogether. And the problem with COVID-19 is, of course, this virus keeps on mutating. And so we need to update the vaccine periodically or use boosters. And this is similar to, but perhaps more enhanced mutation compared to the influenza vaccine. So most people will know that the influenza vaccine formulation is updated every year for the seasonal flu. And this is perhaps what we may have to do with COVID-19, is to update our vaccines on a yearly basis or perhaps as needed so that we can protect the people against this disease, which will become endemic. In other words, COVID-19 will not be eradicated. We will most likely have to live with this disease for generations and generations.
Mm-hmm. So Dr. William Haseltine, so we have to live with this virus, and obviously it is different from the case like with the smallpox. We can get rid of them behind us completely.
That is partly true, but I think it is also very likely that we will, over time, develop very potent antiviral drugs. Let's take another disease, HIV/AIDS. We haven't got a vaccine for that. In fact, the most recent vaccine just failed today. The announcement failed today. That doesn't mean you can't eradicate HIV. In Botswana, they've done it. They've done it through use of drugs that not only treat and reduce the infection, but also prevent infection. We now have a drug that will prevent infection from HIV with one shot every 6 months, probably. It certainly will treat it, and now it's being tested. One shot every 6 months is very likely to prevent it. So if we do the research in your country, in the United States, and where the research can be done best, I think we can do much better than even vaccines. It is true that vaccines are unlikely to stop this infection. That doesn't mean we should give up all hope. We should continue to work as hard as we can to use our best intelligence and drugs to treat and stop this infection.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Shao Yiming, so of course in China there are different vaccines also available. The thing is, are we still, investing in new vaccines with the hope with the higher vaccination rate, and so we can somehow build a wall to stop the spread of the disease?
Yes, I would like to go back to your initial question, which is, smallpox is a DNA virus. The virus has a DNA polymerase. It has keep the virus in high fidelity, no mutation, the DNA virus. For COVID, it's RNA viruses. The polymerase make a lot of mistake when replicate the virus. And the virus has a lot of mutations. This is one thing. Second thing is the virus, the vaccine we used for COVID mostly are non-replicating vaccines. For smallpox, including the polio or the measles, we all use a live attenuated vaccine. The vaccine is like a viral infection. It has a stronger immunity, long durability. Like a smallpox vaccine can last, protection lasts 10 years. So unlike the non-replicating type of vaccine, or we call dead vaccines, last about 6 months. And another thing we cannot eradicate because the smallpox do not have animal reservoir. It affects only human. So the COVID virus has many animal reservoirs. We can control the human infection. Like in China, we have in the zero COVID control period, we have knocked down 106 times outbreaks. But there are so many animal reservoirs, we cannot eradicate the COVID epidemic. That's another reason. So I think we are totally talk about different viruses, different vaccines, and also different control strategies. As to your second question, we are continue develop new vaccines to help to fill in the gaps. Maybe we can discuss that later with
Yeah, we will talk more about
colleagues.
Yes, the vaccines and vaccination. Thank you, Dr. Shao there. And Dr. Dennis Carroll, is it possible that we will develop a new vaccine which is safe and is so effective that, with everybody basically get vaccinated and then we can stop the spread of the virus?
Well, first off, thank you for inviting me to be part of this discussion. I think we've learned over the last 3 years as the coronavirus has both spread and evolved that our current ability to control this virus by way of vaccines is very limited. We know that the vaccines that we developed at the very beginning of the pandemic, in fact, protected against infection. The very first iteration of this virus, the vaccine was protective against. But the virus evolved, it continued to adapt, and the vaccines that have been generated since no longer protect against infection, but they are extremely effective in preventing severe illness and death. So the strategy and the purpose of the vaccines today is really to keep people out of hospitals, particularly the most vulnerable, high-risk populations that without a vaccination would be experiencing very severe illness and likely death. So the vaccines now allow us really to really lower mortality, but it doesn't stop the spread of this virus at all. And it will continue to evolve as long as it has the ability to spread.
It's a good point, Dr. Alice Tan. We mentioned at the introduction of this discussion, in China too, there are rumors, people questioning the effectiveness of the vaccine. They say, oh, even I'm vaccinated, I still got infected. So what's the point of having vaccination? As Dr. Dennis Carroll mentioned it very clearly, it is for the purpose of preventing serious illness or, a death even. But how can we get the message through to people that you need to get vaccinated? Even you will get infected, but you will be protected.
Right. Well, I think we need to present the data perhaps a little more effectively, especially to the elderly population, the people who need the vaccinations the most because they are most vulnerable to severe disease and death. I think we can let them know what the studies have shown in terms of 3 doses of Sinovac, Coronavac, say in Hong Kong, highly protective against death due to even Omicron. That is what the data show. And let them know that this has been proven among their peers. And also, I think what we can do is just use a little bit of storytelling, perhaps, to convince people who are hesitant about getting vaccination to go ahead and get the shot. For example, in my household, my grandmother was infected with COVID early on in the pandemic, and unfortunately, she ended up dying due to the disease, and this was 2 months before vaccines became available. My father is the oldest son of the family, and to this day, he feels guilty about his mother's death in a nursing home due to COVID. He cries every time he thinks about his mother dying alone due to COVID in a nursing home. Tell people these kinds of stories so that they are moved beyond just the facts. The human aspect of why they need to get vaccinated is to keep themselves safe and to keep their families safe against severe disease and death.
Yeah, to protect the people you love. Sorry to hear that, but that's obviously very touching. I mean, what happened there to you and your family, and people will feel related to that, hopefully. And Dr. William Haseltine, there are different vaccines and different types of vaccines, I would say. Inactive vaccines, or active vaccines, or mRNA vaccines, some new technologies, some traditional means of producing the technology. How different are they?
Well, these vaccines are actually quite different. But the question is, what's the bottom line for people? And the bottom line turns out, in the end, they're all not that different in terms of their ability to protect from serious disease and death. That's the very good news, that they may not all protect from infection against the initial strain the same way. But as you look through time, and there's been several direct comparisons between, say, mRNA and the 2 Chinese inactivated vaccines, very different techniques. What they found is they both had dramatic effects in reducing, at least 2 doses, dramatic effects in reducing hospitalization and death. Now, 3 doses of the Chinese vaccines were extremely effective. There is some small difference between the effectiveness of hospitalization and death between the Chinese and the mRNA vaccines. But when you actually look at it on a population basis and look at what's happening in China right now, the expectation was there would be millions of deaths because of the current wave. I actually rather doubt that. The Chinese population is relatively well vaccinated with 2 doses of the vaccines. That should protect most young people under 60 and more than half to 2/3 or even more of the elderly who are infected but vaccinated. So the message, I think, from this program should be get vaccines, get vaccinated often. I myself I'm vaccinated every 4 months, whether I've been infected or not, which I was. And I tell all my friends in my family to be vaccinated every 4 months. That might be a little excessive, but every 6 months is not. We're used to getting a flu vaccine every year. I think we'll be getting, in the future, respiratory syncytial virus, influenza virus, and COVID at least once a year, and maybe COVID vaccines twice a year. We don't know how long protection against serious disease lasts, but so far, it certainly lasts longer than protection against infection of all the vaccines, and that's really good news for people.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Shao Yiming, share with us your observation of this, basically we can call it like a first wave of infection in China, which largely concluded, I would say, in most parts of the country. Your observation of the serious cases or the death or the effectiveness of the Chinese vaccine in particular, and that's part of the question, right?
Yeah, I think as you mentioned, people say why, if the vaccine cannot protect the infection, why we use it? I think there are two traps there. One is the vaccine actually is designed. Most of the vaccine is designed to prevent disease. It's like when we have a placebo-controlled trial, we only test those who has reported symptoms to see if they are get a viral infection. People no symptoms, we don't test them. So the vaccine, the endpoint of the study is to reduce disease. So that is one thing. Second, in the past, before COVID, human society never have a large-scale nucleic acid test to look with a microscopy to look for infections. Or several thousand years infectious disease control, we never done that. So formally, we do not know actually how many infections have been happened for many other vaccines. But this time we had this. So it tends to see the vaccine is no use. Actually, it's used very, very good. Our colleagues have mentioned the Hong Kong study and many other countries' study have shown that vaccination protects severe disease, hospitalization, and death. That is no question. Uh, I think there's another, all vaccines have such an effect. So that is a pretty good thing. Both the traditional inactivated and new technology mRNA vaccine, they all can reach that. But that is not enough. We still want to develop new vaccines to see if they can provide a certain protection to infection. This is to control the epidemic spread. In China, actually, we have already approved 12 vaccines. That is the efforts to further develop new vaccines to can further protect infection. Including we have 5 inactivated vaccine, 5 protein vaccine, and also we have 2 viral vector. 2 of them has been used the nasal vaccine, inhalation. So all the other vaccines are used injection in the muscular injection, but they do not provide a strong protection in the mucosal, where the virus come in to infect us. So now there are 2 vaccines approved in China for nasal and mucosal use. So that we are just testing if they can provide a certain help to prevent infection. So there are new generation vaccines. There will be WHO also encouraging for nasal use vaccine for provide a better protection for infection.
Some new development or good to know progress is being made there. And Dennis Carroll, here's another question about the protection. When people got infected and then we know that or we will get immunity from the infection, how strong is that kind of immunity? In particular, if you compare that immunity with the immunity people get from vaccination.
Well, that's really an important question because, as we know, most of the world has not had access to the vaccine. But there's speculation that several billion people on the planet have already been infected and carry some protective effect by virtue of that infection. So I think as we go forward, we're going to be finding a combination of both vaccination and natural infection as triggers for giving you the kind of immunity that will reduce severe illness and death. And let's be very clear that when we talk about severe illness and death, we're talking about principally high-risk groups. For most of the population, infections tend to be mild. But for people over the age of 60 and people with pre-existing conditions who may have other underlying conditions, a cancer or some kind of illness or diabetes. Those are the populations that are most at risk. And we know that vaccines are really the key to limiting their illness, really being able to protect them from severe illness. So as we think about going into the future, it's really critical that we target the high-risk groups. Not all populations are equally vulnerable, and making sure that those high-risk groups are getting the vaccine, natural infection does not provide for those high-risk groups the kind of protective effect that it may provide for younger, healthier people.
Dr. Alice Tan, of course, we know that there's the mutation ongoing. For example, with Omicron, there are subgroups over there. And even there are combinations of different types of virus, like Delta and Omicron, for example. And we're not clear like how lethal that could be, the new strain or the new kind of virus over there. So does that mean, our pharmaceutical companies will continue to develop new vaccines or new generations of vaccines to deal with probably newly mutated strains or viruses there?
I think there are two possibilities. First is, as we have a bivalent formulation of the mRNA vaccines, basically it's mRNA that codes for the spike protein of the BA4 and BA5 subvariants of Omicron, in addition to the original strain of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So we may see modified strains, compositions of vaccines going forward, or if we are able to develop a pan-coronavirus vaccine that offers sort of a variant-proof protection that is durable, then we may not need as frequent updated vaccinations. So those are a few possibilities that we have on the horizon. I would like to add one word about reinfection rates. Here in South Korea, 1 in 5 of our new diagnoses of COVID-19 are reinfection cases. So this is something that other countries need to keep in mind. As we have more immune evasive variants and subvariants, the population that has had their first wave of infections, they may be still vulnerable to subsequent infections. And unfortunately, our data have shown that the risk of dying actually goes up by almost twofold with the second infection. And so these are all reasons to stay up to date on your vaccinations and really to do whatever you can to try to avoid getting infected.
So Dr. Alice Tan, so can we say we can be a little bit more more positive about the reinfection because obviously it's lower 20% of the population will get reinfected, and also the seriousness will be much, much less than the first wave of infection?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. So not necessarily will the second infection be less severe than the first. It's not guaranteed. So that's why we still need to be careful. And that's why we need to try to come up with a pan-coronavirus vaccine that gives durable protection, so we're not having to race against this virus and its mutations to try to protect our population.
Well, Dr. William Haseltine, so reinfection obviously will happen. Some people got reinfected probably for more than a couple of times, third time, a fourth time. So that's not a direct line of weaker impact on the body. So we need, that's the reason probably we need to get vaccinated frequently.
Well, there are a couple of reasons. The first is, one thing we haven't talked about is long COVID. And if you have been infected, even mildly, and may not even know you're infected, you might get long COVID. Whether that's 4% or 10%, it's a lot of people. And it has a serious economic effect on the workforce. It has a long-term effect, and sometimes we don't know how long COVID is going to last, at least 3 years in some cases. So I think there's a lot of reasons to avoid infection, even in young populations. The major brunt of long COVID isn't on old people, it's on people between 30 and 50. So there's a big problem with long COVID that we haven't talked about. Let me also talk about the possibility of a pan-coronavirus vaccine. That's a dream, but I think it's a dream that may never be realized, because the intrinsic nature of this virus is to reinfect an adult immunocompetent person who is recently infected. That's what this virus evolved to do for many tens of millions of years. And there are many tricks it does. It does three tricks. The first is it goes in and it suppresses your immune system. The second trick is really fast. So it gets out, in, and out of you before you can remember you've had it. And the third trick is the one we've talked about, is changing its coat. But all three of these tricks are mutating. It's getting faster, it's getting stronger, it's suppressing the immune system. So unless you have a super high concentration of protection against the exact virus that you get, this virus is going to get you. So that's why I don't think we're going to have a pan vaccine, at least with the foreseeable technology we have. That doesn't mean, and I want to emphasize this again, we have undervalued, underestimated, and underinvested in antiviral drugs. The ones we have are sort of good. They protect some people from serious consequences, but they don't prevent infection. We can develop many better drugs. So we're not fighting with both hands. We're fighting with one hand. We need to fight with both hands, vaccines and drugs. And this hand is very weak at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Well, both hands there. Dr. Dennis Carroll here, there's a Dr. Shira Doran from the Tufts Medical Center said that we can build an immunity wall through repeated infection or repeated vaccination. But then there are worries that this can lead to blunted vaccine effectiveness or reduction in protection relative to people who are unvaccinated. Is this the case?
I'm sorry, could you repeat your question? I didn't quite understand it.
Right, basically the idea is that there's a suggestion we could build an immunity wall by repeated vaccination or repeated infection. Is this the case?
Well, certainly with vaccinations, we can maintain a high level of protection. There's no question about that, and we've seen that over the last 2 years. Natural infection is much, much more difficult to calculate. It has to do with just how severely you are infected, and what's the overall amount of virus that may be, infecting you.
Right.
So vaccines provide you with a known amount of protection, and natural infection may provide some. We don't know how long that protection would be. Again, I think differentiating between the populations that are more vulnerable than others, I think we really have to be much more strategic. There is this issue of long COVID, and still that is a significant mystery as to who gets long COVID and how long COVID lasts. We still don't understand that. But for severe illness and death, we understand who that population is, and we need to make sure those are the people that are getting priority access to vaccines.
Right. Dr. Shao Yiming, very briefly, so after the first wave of infection, that means China will continue, despite that, will continue to focus on the vaccination.
Yeah, I think that's right. Approach, by repeated vaccination, there are limits because not only the resources for vaccine, but also our inner resources for immune system. We cannot overwhelm the immune system by one disease.
Right.
Second is the repeated infection.
Sorry
you have a high cost of life.
Dr. Shao. Well, that's all the time we have. With that, we come to the end of today's discussion. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xin Duo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.